All right, so we're talking about A Hard Day's Night this month. And so, as usual, let's start with kind of initial impressions, reactions, and then I'd also be curious to see if you thought the film was worth watching or if you thought I was crazy for choosing it.
I'll go first here. 'Cause on the heels of that, I definitely was surprised this was considered one of the or supposed to be a very good film because it actually made me kind of like the Beatles a little bit less at the end of it. And I'm not sure if that's because I teach students all the time, and I thought I was more empathizing with the guy who's trying to manage them, and I was like, no, this is just gets exhausting and is immature. But I thought it was fun, but it didn't strike me as quite as great as some of the other films we were watching. So yeah, so I mean, I enjoyed it, but I didn't. It's like miles away from Lawrence of Arabia or something like that for me. I'm a grumpy old man. Is that the problem?
Those darn kids. Get off my grass.
Yeah.
Get off my field.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Yeah. That was me.
I appreciate. I mean, I appreciated a lot of the humor in it. I thought it was pretty funny sometimes. The writing was, I thought, pretty witty. But no, I was kind of in the same boat. Because then I started reading some of the other stuff afterwards. So after watching it, I was like, oh, that was funny. Like, hey, it's the Beatles. They're young. They're kind of trying to show off kind of how hip they are and all that kind of. And they come across very boyish in the film. So I just thought it was kind of light and fun. But then as I was reading other things, like Roger Ebert was like, this is a life-affirming film. MTV gives them this big award afterwards, and I was like, it was that influential? Because it didn't strike me as being that influential, or it didn't strike me as being a serious enough film to have really been as influential as a lot of people ended up saying it was afterwards. So, but yeah, so that was my initial impression.
Well, I kind of feel like I had to participate in this film discussion to kind of represent my generation. References to the Who song, quite intended. Beatles don't come across as being what we think of them by the time they broke up in I think that was 69, 70. And this really is an introduction. If you remember the movie, the Thing You Do, that featured the one-hit wonders, that was really quite the way that these bands would break in. They would do media like this. And I admit that when I watched it again, and it had been decades since I've seen A Hard Day's Night, I realized, wow, especially in the first opening scene in the railway carriage, where they're kind of mean to the second guy who comes in, the kind of banker type. And I was thinking to myself about how, to my parents' generation, because that's what we're talking about there, how incredibly in your face, even offensive, the kind of the folks in the 60s felt to them. And so it was in some respects it was especially those first, say, 5 to 10 minutes of the movie were uncomfortable for me. I just like, oh yeah, they're being, and I agree, Nick, the wordplay and the scripting and the jokes, the little one-liners were clever, I admit that, but there was kind of this attitude of that I felt with Josh as well. Hey, I've been that guy, and I don't appreciate the thought that some young punk who doesn't know really anything, or really doesn't know anything, is going to start making fun of me just because he can, and taking advantage of the fact that he's rude and I'm not. You know, so there's this whole thing that kind of bubbles up in me, and I'm just like, ah. Anyway, so that was, but the music, of course, I love the music. It was the music of my own youth. The film is very arty, and in terms of the comments about its influence, kind of like watching Rosebud. What's the movie?
Citizen Kane.
Citizen Kane. Kind of like watching Citizen Kane. You say that was influential because it was the first. Everybody copied it, and so for this genre of the kind of the rock band movie, this was very influential, arty, that kind of a thing. So it was considered kind of a big deal at the time because nobody was doing anything like this. Okay, that's my little rant.
Yeah, I think several of you have mentioned kind of the interaction of the Beatles with the kind of older generation, and I think it's interesting that this film kind of there's a lot of those interactions. There's the guy on the train who says, "I fought in the war for you." You have the grandpa, who's a very different older generation. He's I don't know, probably a discussion in himself. You have like the marketing executive who can't tell that George Harrison is actually a Beatle and just treats him as a commodity. You have the TV director who can't handle them. I mean, you have a lot of interactions of the Beatles with kind of older generations, and each one is, I don't know, kind of interesting. And you guys have said that you sided with kind of the older generation, but the movie always seems to land on the Beatles side in some ways. But it kind of lives in that tension, and I'd be curious, like, for you guys to explore more. Is the film trying to tell us we should be more like the Beatles, or should we be skeptical of their way of life?
I don't know. It's hard for me to say yes that we should side more with the Beatles just because of how their history ended up playing out in the end. Just kind of broken up by, well, in some ways it was. I feel like the movie was kind of highlighting what was to come in the '60s with that kind of rebellious. Turning away from the old traditional ways, which we see in all their interactions with the older people, like you were saying. But yeah, then you watch. I mean, I was reading. John Lennon, he died in 1970 something, right? Early '70s.
Yeah, 70. It would have been. Well, I'm trying to think. I remember I was working at Biola when he died. So we're talking about, no, it's actually not 70s. It would have been in the early 80s.
Oh, early. Oh, okay. That makes, all right. Yeah, well, anyway, I mean, even just thinking about in terms of, like, they pretty much as a band, like, they had, from when that movie was made to when it ends, like, right, they got, like, 15 years, like, or only a few years of, like, the peak of their heyday, and then it all kind of goes downhill from there. So, I don't know, but yeah, I mean, I think the movie is kind of putting them in a, what's the word I'm looking for? In a particular kind of light, one in which you kind of sympathize with them a little bit. Like, here they are, these young boys kind of doing this really cool thing, and all they've got are these old guys around them trying to kind of put them in a box or kind of herd them, and they don't want to be herded in any particular direction.
Yeah, I think that's part of what, for me, it rubbed me a little bit the wrong way with the film, is it felt like it is affirming that sort of, hey, look how fun, and they're willing to be lighthearted and not take themselves too seriously, not take life too seriously, and they can that allows them to have fun. But in that way, it's kind of sad to see that the Beatles' story since then has been kind of tragic in many ways, whether in their personal lives or yeah. So there's been some things that I think for me, obviously, would make me look at the film differently many years on, because I feel like, well, unfortunately they can just go on like that. And the other side of this sort of fun-loving is. There's just I'm not sure what I'm saying. It seems like they're trying to hold up and celebrate a certain sort of immaturity that feels like ultimately is going to hurt you, and especially they're like our age, right? Aren't they supposed to be like 23-ish? They're around there at the time of the film.
That's about right.
And so they're just a little bit younger than us, and it feels like, oh man, if I was acting that way, it feels like, well, maybe I don't know, 23, but it feels like. It feels like a prolonged kind of immaturity or boyhood. Like they're acting in a boyish way, but they have all the money and fame of a mega band.
So let me ask this. I'm gonna ask a question. I think related to what Ben is asking is the fact that we've got three commentators. Ben actually hasn't weighed in as to whether he thought that the Beatles were behaving in a childish and immature way and all that sort of stuff. But so we've got at least three guys who just kind of said that. Do you feel like you were someone was attempting to manipulate your loyalties?
Can you explain that? Manipulate loyalties to what?
Yeah, excuse me. I've got a tickle in my throat. So you look at these guys, and you're starting to get a picture that they're definitely not respecting of authority. They violate the biblical commandment to respect your elders. As evangelical Christians, as informed guys, you kind of look at that and say, that's not right. Yet the movie wants you to pull for them. It wants you to enjoy and embrace their mentality and maybe even their ethic. Or am I making too much into that?
Well, I'm wondering. I feel like there's a flip side to it. On the one hand, that they're being really disrespectful and just boyish and immature. But on the other hand, I think they were really, as far as musically and whatnot, they were really doing a new thing, and I think to some extent they had to be willing to disregard the advice and the instruction that they were getting from some of the people that were there, kind of trying to direct them. Otherwise, I'm not sure they would have been the Beatles, right? Or I don't know if they would have produced the music or left the mark on the musical world that they did, had they decided to be a little more proper. But I'm not. So I guess what I'm just saying, I'm not necessarily wanting to justify everything that they did as much as to say, like, no, there's a real tension there of their sort of creative genius needed to kind of break some old barriers, had to, and in some ways that kind of manifested itself in disrespect.
All right, so Nick, does this mean that if you're a genius, you get to live by your own moral code?
No, I'm not saying that
they went up there really, really high, really fast.
Yeah, no. I'm not saying that they get to live by their own moral code. I just think that there's something to be said for the fact that they. Oh gosh, I don't know how I argued myself into this position, but to some extent, the older generation there just didn't understand what they were doing. Because it was new, and I think there always has to be a balance between, recognizing that someone is doing. Because the music that they produced was good music, even though the older generation may not have liked it, and.
Right. So if in that way the guy who's saying I fought the war, and he's although did a very noble thing.
Right.
He's now taking that to take himself way too seriously because he fought the war for young, kids. and in that way needs to be taken a little bit more lightly, even though that's a very noble thing for him to have done.
Right.
But now he sees himself in a sort of self-important way or something.
Well, but we all
Curious.
see ourselves in self-important ways, and including, by the way, the Beatles themselves, who, as you may remember, uh, famously and accurately, John Lennon once said, "We're more popular than Jesus Christ," and of course he got, metaphorically crucified. Let's see if we can beat that analogy even more with a stick. But this to me was the interesting thing. I don't think the movie isn't as it's not as silly as it seems. I think there's a structure to the movie. I think there's pardon my misuse of the term if I'm doing it wrong. There's a meta message. There's a narrative that's being focused, and maybe part of that is a thing that I was trying to trap Nick into, is the idea that the Beatles are being presented as Superman, as a Nietzschean sort of. They have the will, they have the greatness to break the rules, and they do so. And when they choose to abide by the rules, then they will do so, and with little or no consequence, because they get away, and they get at the end of it, it's all a happy ending. They've got the love and adulation of the crowd, and all of that, and yet they have flaunted the rules, they've flaunted morality, they've flaunted their elders, blah blah blah. I don't know. I kind of wonder if there's a little message there. And of course they're doing it, and they're having a great deal of jolly good fun all at the same time. I picked on Nick.
No, that's okay.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm
Yeah.
not so sure with some of or Nick, did you want to say?
No. Go ahead.
Like, I'm not so sure, because although I do, on the one hand, feel a little anti the sort of boyishness of them, I think as far as their influence, the film also portrays them not just as that they should be above everything, but that they are getting a little bit trapped and having maybe too much influence because of their fame. So the fact that they could go run off, or one of them who's kind of could get upset by the rest of the group, and that could ruin this whole guy's career. The guy who's setting up the studio for them to perform in. The fact that they could just have a little bit of a fight and that could wreck his career feels like that's not just putting them as like that. In that way, it feels like it's showing well the way that they're experience they are pretty young, and so they're having a disproportionate amount of effect when what they're doing is just a normal sort of boyish flaunting of the rules or being playful or something like that. Did you guys see it that way?
Yeah, I've been kind of quiet because you guys have been, I don't know, having an interesting discussion, but all on your own. But I think that's something that the film really explores, right? Is what does it mean to be famous? I mean, but like it feels like half the film is just them running away from adoring fans, and I think it ties into what you guys are feeling, right? Like they just want to have fun, but they're being trapped into. They have to work, and they're in some ways you can almost feel this. I don't know, them as a commodity. Like they have to be somewhere. They have to be herded because they have to go on stage. And I think you get the sense that they didn't go into this business to be rushed from one train to another, one show to another, and that's the life they have to live. They can't have fun. They have to go to their hotel room and answer hundreds of fan mail. Like being famous is as much a trap as it is a platform for them to do their performances.
Although, Ben, here's maybe my point, and again, I'm being a little playful here because I'm not sure how seriously to take this, but at the end of the day, they get to run away from their commitments. They never really do settle down to answer their fan mail, and I agree that there is a sense, and you hear this as kind of almost a mythology of famous musicians. All I wanted to do was play my music, and I had to do all this other stuff as well as kind of a parable. But in this case, the movie is structured so that they don't seem to have to. Again, I'm not sure that there are consequences to other people, like the guy who could lose his job if they don't show up at the pre-rehearsal and all that kind of stuff. But I'm not sure that they feel some entrapment, but they kind of escape it at the end, and they're still that happily ever after sort of thing.
But the film does end with them being rushed onto a helicopter to go to it. They have to fly overnight to go to another show.
Oh right, yeah, that's true. That is true. That is how it ends.
Yeah, and I think I'm realizing now maybe like a counterweight to this, to what you were bringing up, Eric, is the kind of, I feel like in some ways the movie could be encapsulated in that near to the final scene in the movie where Paul McCartney's grandfather is talking to Ringo when he's reading a book. Right, like I feel like that whole scene in some ways encapsulates everything that's going on, or all of the themes that are in tension there in the movie, because, right, he's okay, and it's kind of ironic because you have the old guy telling the young kid who's reading, like, what are you doing reading, right? Really, it's more fun if you go out parading, right? And you have Ringo, the young guy, actually making an argument for why he should be reading books instead of out parading around. But then he ends up getting convinced by the old guy that, no, this is the stupid idea. He's like, I'm old and I have a backlog of memories that you don't have because you're busy reading a book.
That's so disturbing.
Yeah. And so then Ringo gets convinced by that and he goes running out and doing his thing. But then ultimately, in the end, ends up coming back to the show, coming back to the band, and doing the work that is required of him as a member of the Beatles. So I'm not sure in that sense. So now I'm hearing an echo of myself. As far as the message of the movie goes, I'm not sure that there's a clear Nietzschean interpretation that you can go with. As far as this would be.
Oh, I really want to play with that though.
I know, like I think it's there in some way, but I don't think it's there in a very pure way. I think it's held in balance, held in tension with.
Yeah, but that's what makes it manipulative. All right, I'm sorry. I'll let that go.
Actually, in that way, I think I'm leaning a bit towards. I'm hearing an echo as well. I was hearing you echo a lot, and now I'm hearing myself a little bit. I'm leaning a lot. Watching the film made me like the Beatles less because they felt so much less boyish and so much less profound than I expected them to be. And this conversation is helping me that perhaps I was doing the same thing that the people in the film were doing, holding them up as like more than human. I was holding them up as that they should be found in everything that they do. And because I really love their music, to be very thoughtful and intentional with everything that they do, and allow them to just be fairly nice guys, a little bit immature in their. Is it me? Let me see if I turn mine off.
Okay, I'm also fixing some things here as well. So.
Could you hear echo and done.
Yeah, it's still kind of there.
Nick, could you talk?
Okay.
Yeah, I can still kind of hear myself.
So Josh has muted it now. There's still an echo.
Yeah.
Which is weird.
Oh.
Google.
Okay.
Google doesn't want us to talk today. Sorry, Josh. Go ahead.
Josh, what were you saying?
Oh no, I was just wanting to hear what your guys' thoughts on that were. That I had idealized the Beatles film, and so seeing a film about a bunch of kids, not kids, but like young, like me, and a little bit younger, and being more like my students than like myself. Then I tried to trying to act with my students. But maybe I was holding them to a standard, or not a standard, but I was wanting them to be something that they weren't. I was wanting to fill in my own blanks of who were the Beatles, um, because they're so famous.
Do you feel like the movie played into the idealization of the Beatles?
Oh,
I'm turning off the video to see if it'll help the audio.
Okay.
Sorry, Nick, you were saying, what were you saying?
I was asking Josh if he feels like the movie played into or played up that ideal image that he had, and I think that a lot of people have of the Beatles.
no.
It was interesting though. Like I was reading, and it seems like this film. I mean, when it started, the Beatles were just kind of, when they started working on it, the film was just, the Beatles were just kind of launching their career. By the time it came out, it was Beatlemania had happened, obviously, even while they were filming. But in many ways, it did kind of, like, this film is an encapsulation, almost a documentary of what it was like to be in the Beatles and to live during the time that the Beatles were in their heyday. And I would think in many ways it probably defined who the Beatles were to the larger culture.
Could I possibly mute Mr. I think his for a moment to see if it goes away, or maybe Mr. Mistelt, would you mind muting yourself for a second?
I will attempt to do that. Yes.
I saw your sound bar go up and up time Ben spoke.
Okay. So.
All right. Is the echo still there?
No, I
Can
don't
you
hear
hear
it.
me? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Super. It's my fault.
Sorry, Ben. You were saying that.
I'm just saying, like, I'm wondering if this film, if it didn't necessarily define what the definition of the Beatles were, or kind of like your interpretation of them, it may have at least encapsulated how people viewed the Beatles at that time. I'm wondering how much of this is documentary and how much of it is presenting the Beatles to an entire generation. Like, they are famous. You do have certain like views of the Beatles, but this film was a success, and I wonder if this film kind of was a presentation medium of who the Beatles were just as much as seeing the concert on the Ed Sullivan Show. In terms of the popular understanding of the Beatles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure. It seemed like to me, when I was watching it, it seemed like a kind of dramatized snapshot of the Beatles, or maybe it seemed like a snapshot of what we wanted to think the Beatles were like when they weren't on stage, kind of thing. These fun, witty, boyish musicians. So I don't know to what extent that was not fictionalized, but sort of playing up the image that was already there, kind of affirming what people wanted to be true, and how much of it was really establishing them as that for the public.
There is a nature of the kind of celebrity status that we like to see our celebrities being. We have an idealized view of them. If you even think about the context here, the cultural context is British. They have a queen at the time who was actually beginning to flirt with the idea of letting the common people have a view into the palace, if you will, to see them, to see the Queen and her family as real human beings. And this was actually kind of a shocking sort of turn of events for the monarchy. The idea that we like to have an idealized view of our heroes, and the Beatles clearly came across. I mean, the music was genuinely different and good and spectacular and creative. Nick, you're absolutely right. I would go so far as to say you really can't overstate the influence of the Beatles. And in truth, it was. I mean, we could talk about the music for some time, but they did have kind of a vibe that went with them, and this was that vibe. We're fun. We are having a good time. We're just a bunch of chaps. We're getting together, having fun. I just flashed on. You know that that YouTube U2 video that came out within the last week, where they were sitting around answering questions.
Yeah, I heard about it. I hadn't seen it, but I know what you're talking about.
So what one of the comments is, gosh, these guys seem just like us, except they're U2. And in a sense, that's kind of a similar sort of feeling I get here. It is idealized. Obviously, it's silly. Real people don't act this way, but it definitely was there was a vibe that was trying to be communicated, and this was part of what it was to be a Beatles lover, is to love that vibe.
Yeah,
I still see images of Nietzscheism. I'm not going to let that go.
Nietzsche is everywhere.
You brought up the music, and I realize we haven't really talked about that at all. And part of the legacy of this film is how much it inspired different music videos and style of music videos and future music films. What did you guys think of the music? How do you feel it fit in with the movie? What was its place? Did you feel it was I don't know. Any thoughts about the music within the film?
Well, that was something I was going to say. Again, as far as the music and the movie goes, I feel like one of the dangers of creating a movie like that of the band that's kind of playing into this ideal image that everyone already has of them is. And kind of like we were talking about earlier, and this idea that they're these happy-go-lucky, immature boys. We also forget that to create the music that they created was hard work. Like, they didn't just show up in the studio and play songs as well as they did. That took some real creative discipline and work to foster, and then ultimately to create the Beatles to create that image of the Beatles that everyone fell in love with. And that a lot of those guys, I mean, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Paul McCartney still has proven himself to be a really great musician, both as a songwriter and his musical talent. I think that's one thing I would have liked to have seen more in the movie itself, though I realize that wasn't the point of the movie either. So it was, I don't know, I guess my point was just to say the music was great. I really liked the music, and as I was kind of thinking about them as a band and thinking about how many hours they must have been spending in a studio to create the sound that they created, kind of actually ended up making me appreciate the movie a little bit more, even though that wasn't necessarily there.
Yeah, I just kind of play into that. Their music is kind of simple in some ways, and listening to it, I think it can make you forget that you have to be a good musician, or that they were good musicians and that they were sitting around writing lyrics as well as writing the songs, and they were practicing their instruments. You could almost believe that they did just kind of show up 5 minutes before powdered out for the cameras, and then stepped on stage and played. We saw a little bit of that when they had to go through rehearsal sets. That they skipped the next rehearsal set and they were fine. And the rehearsal set seemed more for the people who were running the studio, so they could feel comfortable that everything was going to go according to plan. That they didn't really need to practice.
Yeah. I guess maybe, Ben, to get to your question a little bit, we could ask to what extent did the song selection kind of play into the narrative of the movie itself? I don't know if anyone has any initial thoughts on that.
There we go.
Well, even the title, yeah.
Right. No, the title was determined. I think Ben probably read some of the same sources I did. The title was determined by Ringo Starr having just made a comment about how it was a hard day's night after he had partied hard the night before. Are you guys all aware of the kind of 10,000 hour sort of thing that you have to put in 10,000 hours before you become confident or something? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what, if I remember, one of the, I haven't read the book yet, but I think in the book itself he mentions the Beatles and all of their time in playing in Hanover, in the club there. I think it was the Cave, and that because of that, they had honed their musical skills. They actually, by the time they went on tour, they bumped off George Best and brought in Ringo Starr to increase their musical proficiency, because their buddy turned out to not actually have the musical chops to do it. So these guys were serious about their craft, and in a sense, if I remember, Ben, do you remember this? The kind of the point of the movie was initially for somebody to be able to make some money off of the soundtrack and sell Beatles music albums as a soundtrack to the movie. That was like some sort of contractual.
But so a lot of the songs were written for the movie, and so they had a companion album that went out called A Hard Day's Night, and so that album was sold at the same time, and United Artists, who fronted the money for the movie, also got any profits from the album. So I mean, they were selling them both together, and at the time, this was a pretty common thing to have a movie, as you said earlier, to have a movie that comes out with the band to kind of showcase the band and their music. And I mean, it was definitely, let's just get this thing done as quick as possible. I think I listened to an interview with the director, and they only had like a few weeks to film and like 3.5 weeks to edit the thing. Like, it was definitely just kind of rushed out the door. Let's make a profit before the Beatles disappear, which they just thought the fad was going to go away and the Beatles were going to be history. So they were just trying to push it out the door as fast as possible and make a quick buck. But I don't think anyone anticipated it being, despite all of that, being as good a movie as it was, especially in comparison to other kind of band films. And I mean, I think a large part of that is the music that was created for the movie.
So those songs hadn't been heard before?
At least a few of them. Like I'm like because I know that the title for the movie, A Hard Day's Night, wasn't picked until pretty close before they started filming, because they had just kind of come up with that song. As I say, like Ringo came out, like said the name, John went away and wrote the song, and then they recorded it. That one was done pretty quickly, but. And now it's an iconic song.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead, Nick.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say I was reading about how the song got written, and just thought it was funny that Ringo Starr was just known for saying things like that, like just out of the blue would kind of say what was what sounded like was going to be a common phrase that people usually say, but then he would say it just wrong, and that ended up being the inspiration for the song and then ultimately the title.
Yeah, this this is making me realize actually how much I did believe the movie's portrayal of them. That it did shape my perspective a bit more negatively of the Beatles, and realizing, oh, that they did kind of sidestep all the hard work and the ways in which they put in the effort, because you just see John Lennon as running around with the rest of the guys and Paul McCartney, and you don't see them sitting down, being disciplined and writing a song, thinking through it, practicing it, maybe editing it, playing it in front of someone else, seeing what they think. You really see them just kind of messing around. You almost get the feeling that they would write the song while on the train with the girls watching, kind of for the girls, and not so you then just saying, oh, John Lennon then wrote the song and things. I'm realizing, oh yeah, I did kind of believe that the Beatles were just like that.
They make it seem too easy in the movie.
Yeah. Well, and what's cool about it, like the Beatles were writing their own songs. Like they, as far as I know, I don't know to what extent they had other people writing some of their stuff, but I know that they were writing a good portion of it. Which again, when I watched the movie, I'm like, kind of missed out on that. That would have been cool.
Well, one of the things is that the Beatles had done a lot of covers of other guys' stuff, Roll Over Beethoven, which they did. This movie, I remember reading, is one of the first times that they were able to do something, and they did not cover somebody else's work. All of the music is original. Which actually says something because of some of the differences. So you had Hard Day's Night, you had And I Loved Her, that kind of little sort of classical guitar thing that they do on the stage set. Some of them are actually rather different. So that was one of the kind of turning points actually for the Beatles' own career, is they from that point on did only their own stuff. They didn't cover other people's work. So that was a unique part of the movie and what that did. As a phenomena, it is intriguing to me. I can't remember what was the date of this movie. It was 64. 64. And the Beatles would stay together as a group for another basically 6 years, and that's it, 5-6 years, and they were done. And yet the phenomena lives on, even to such an extent that you guys, who are the next generation, you know their music. But you don't know the Byrds. You don't know. You know Eric Clapton as an old guy. I mean, you just the phenomena is really incredible. There was something different about their music. So anyway.
Yeah, I realized earlier when I mentioned, when I was asking when did John Lennon die, I was looking that up. John Lennon did die in 1980, but George Harrison died. Oh, never mind. Wait, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Scratch that. I was thinking that one of them died like in the early 70s, which would put 5 or 6 years after that movie was made, that everything started falling apart. But no, it was Lennon who died first.
Yeah, the group broke apart, and in retrospect, apparently some of the pressures were Yoko Ono and John Lennon. Apparently, Yoko Ono came in to that group, and she was not a good mix. At least that's the popular sort of story that folks of my generation tell. And so we're all a little pissed off at Yoko Ono for messing with the Beatles. But there were already internal fractures between them as well, and them all beginning to say, I was doing this as a kid, and now, in a sense, Ben, you're quite right, is that the story of their career and eventual breakup was, we're trapped in this thing. I did this thing when I was in my early 20s. Now I'm in my late 20s. I want to do something with my music, and I can't. I'm still doing this, what used to be called bubblegum, rock and teeny bopper music, which is really funny because you listen to the Beatles stuff, and it really doesn't have that vibe at all. It has a very different feel to it. Um, but they were ultimately trapped by their own success, and the only way for them to escape was to break up. So yeah, it was kind of an interesting phenomenon. Um, I'd like to you had I'd kind of like to get back to the movie at some point. I do want to hit on the grandfather figure, but if you guys want to talk about the phenomenon more, that's fine. But the grandfather figure is interesting to me, so I'd like to get to that at some point.
Yeah, I think that's where I was going to go next. I think just to finish, like it's interesting. Like a year later, they stopped touring because all of their concerts were like the final concert in the film. They couldn't hear themselves perform, and it kind of to your point, Nick, of them being musicians, they were just like, if no one's gonna hear, we can't even hear ourselves perform. They can't hear us. What's the point of playing live? Because they felt their music deserved better than that. And so I don't know. It's just an interesting note. But I mean, it's like a year later from this movie. But yeah, the grandpa. I mean, in some way, he's an interesting figure because unlike the other older generation people, he's not a respectable old man. In some ways, he's more rock and roll, more out there than the Beatles themselves, and is often instigating everything. And so I'd be curious what you guys thought of him, his role in the movie, and if that does his. I guess what I'm getting at is, does his role in the movie make you think that the Beatles are less crazy for what they're doing? Because they're not the craziest people in the movie.
He felt the grandfather, who was of course very clean, turns out to have been, and of course the reference is he's a clean old man as opposed to a dirty old man. That's the joke, right? So but it turns out he really is the instigator. He's like a little demon figure, or an imp, maybe would be the better word. He's impish, and he seems to have little to no self-control, and no sense of responsibility. He just wants to go off and play. He's more of a 3-year-old than he's a 3-year-old boy in an old man's body.
Well, actually, a 3-year-old might be a little bit more innocent. 3-year-old with a teenager's desires and.
Yeah, it is kind of funny in how he kind of lends some perspective to the Beatles' boyishness throughout the movie. Although I guess maybe it just makes them look more innocent. He seems more conniving in his desire to thwart popular, or strong traditions, popular notions about working hard and things like that. Whereas the Beatles come across seeming just more like, oh, we just want to have fun, right? And they're not necessarily out to stir up trouble.
And it feels like you'd be a little afraid of what would happen if he was one of the Beatles and had their power over women and over people. That he could wield that charm. What he would do with that.
Yeah. And it's interesting too that like Paul McCartney's character, and then eventually I think all of the Beatles, like they are very aware of who the grandfather is. They know he's a troublemaker, and so I don't know. I guess that that would be interesting to talk about. It's kind of like their relationship to the grandfather in that moment.
Yeah, it's interesting because you see everyone else in the film feeling responsible for the Beatles, trying to hurt that, and then they feel responsible for the grandfather. You have like this kind of relationship of responsibility. They too can't just do whatever they want because they have to keep track of the grandfather.
Yeah.
So does the grandfather become kind of a psychological manifestation of where the Beatles, hey, this is what we really would be wanting to do, except there are some people who are corralling us, but the grandfather kind of represents what we really want to do. Rather than just be 23-year-old guys, we want to be 3-year-old little boys running around, um, tasting the world on the big stage. Although, kind of some of the grandfather's comments, and why would he, like, his first escape is to the casino, right? And so that definitely is not a 3-year-old sort of escape. I'm not sure what quite to make of that.
Yeah, I wonder if 3-year-old isn't the correct analogy, but someone who, I don't know, he's very intent on rejecting any sort of authority or control over himself. I mean, the police are trying to protect him, and his reaction is to just like fight them and initiate an escape when all they're trying to do is give him some tea, and like it's just like any sort of authority or anything over him he's pushing against. And it seems like, in contrast, the Beatles, no, they don't necessarily like being always confined into a room or something, but at the end of the day, they come back when they need to. They're on set when they absolutely have to be. Like, there is some sort of, they will follow the rules when necessary. They're not, their goal is not just to break rules to break rules.
All right, so why the grandfather then? What is his place and purpose in the movie, in the narrative, in the story that's trying to be told?
Perhaps there is some sort of way in which he's showing the innocence of their fun, that although this is a dangerous line of reasoning, they don't have a high regard for rules they don't see the reason behind, but they're also not innately suspicious of all the authority or rules that are placed over them. Yeah, I don't know, maybe it's giving showing some sort of way in which their play is actually good. Maybe that's how you could describe it as life-affirming, like the way to be playful.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you for bringing that phrase back up, because when I read that in Roger Ebert's essay, I'm not really sure what he means exactly by life affirming, but I think, yeah, it's I mean, it probably is something along those lines, like you were saying, like somehow or another. Yeah, the grandfather is really suspicious of all authority, whereas the Beatles seem to just seem to kind of kick against it to see what they can get away with, but will ultimately, in the end, they'll do the show in the end. Whereas maybe the grandfather probably might not have done the show if he had his way. So I don't know. I mean, kind of back to that theme of respect for traditional rules, and I don't know, maybe some kind of moral code, or what it looks like to, just if our image for those sorts of things are coming from their manager Norm and from the guy who was wearing that god awful sweater. Like, I think that was my favorite line in the movie when one of them said, he probably doesn't have a wife, and then another one said, like, well, he might, and she probably knitted him that sweater, and he was like, yeah, well, she knitted him. Like, but yeah, if they're, I feel like they're supposed to be a kind of image of an older way of life that they're kind of trying to, maybe not, impose, because the manager is always mad at them, trying to get them to do what they're supposed to do, and then they're always kind of kicking against it, going like, no, but we have these other ideas, but we always end up getting the job done like what you want from us, though we don't do it the way you want us to do it. Whereas the grandpa seems to be a kind of like, no, all authority is, out to get you, kind of conspiracy theorist, and so he'll do whatever he can to undermine it.
And in that way, I think the Beatles are actually supporting the sort of spirit of whatever they think is the traditional way of doing things. They're going to be very loyal. They're still going to be polite most of the time. Whereas their grandpa is actually kind of against the spirit of like actually having a police force in the first place, and these other things, and traditional morality, right? He's going to say you should get away with whatever you can while you're young. And in that way, the Beatles kick against it, but they don't seem to kick against fundamentally. Like there doesn't seem to be a real animosity between them and the manager. It's kind of like a frustration of like, come on, why can't you just do what, you know what I'm saying? Sometimes it seems like you take joy in this, but the Beatles leave to go get their friend, and there's this, you see them dealing with the hierarchy of, well, we need to be back on time for the show, which is why they're going to come back, assuming that he got back there, but out of loyalty to their friend, and they're going to go look for him. And yeah, I see them kind of trying to go for the spirit of the spirit.
There is something about the grandfather that kind of occurred to me. We keep focusing on this idea, which I don't think is warranted, that it was the generation just slightly before me, about 10 years before me, the kind of 60s hippie sort of thing, when within American culture and American European culture of the 20th century, really the first rebellions against established authority in anything that we could call popular culture occurred after World War I. During that time, so you had the flappers, you had that whole flapper culture thing, and then later the beatnik culture of the 50s after World War II. Those are easy to forget about because by the time it gets around to the 60s, we get to now the hippies in the late 60s and early 70s, that now it becomes in a way, a commercialized commodity. That I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm realizing, I've come to realize that it wasn't my generation or actually the people who were a decade before me who were the people who realized that there was an established authority, that they rebelled. It was my mom and dad. It was them coming out of the Depression, having watched that. They were the ones who actually kind of, in a sense, set the stage for the hippies and the people in the 60s to come on the scene and actually now make that a pervasive sort of cultural theme. So, in a sense, the grandfather who represents that age group, you look at him and say, that actually sort of fits. He's that guy who grew up and in a sense he is a rebel. He's got this Irish accent. He says he's a member of the army, the Irish Republican Army, right? He talks about all the bobbies there who are trying to serve him tea as, you know, torturers and all of that sort of stuff. But he actually represents that early generation that was kind of the first bit of the 20th century to decide that rebellion against authority, rebellion against the world order, was in fact a good thing. So I'm kind of, again, I'm shooting from the hip here, but I'm kind of looking at the grandfather in those kind of lights as this discussion is going on. I'm not sure if that gets any resonance or traction with you guys.
So looking at him not as a counterweight to them, but as a precursor or someone who laid the groundwork for them to be able to do what they're doing. Well, we should probably wrap up. It's been an hour, but thank you guys. Hopefully this discussion was somewhat enlightening and made it feel, while not a Lawrence of Arabia, Josh, a somewhat, I don't know, meaningful or thought-provoking movie. And we'll come back next month and talk about another one.
Yeah. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.